Here is Sailor Studio 167, and this is a very, very light green that the swatch first made me think of cucumber water, and it is very light. Strangely, there is very little tone shift as paper changes. Very surprisingly, yes, it does show some shading. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs just as well as it did on the premium stuff. I can say in person, it is more readable, less it's very light. It's readable, not really readable. But a full page of this may be a bit straining to read. It could be a good second color, though it gives general smudges as needed in notes, like not smudges, general nudges as needed in notes. Just add that little bit. Very gentle nudge because this is so light. But I feel no need to have a bottle of this. It is just too light for me to really use up a bottle.
The pen for today is a Platinum 3776. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
I have a feeling that the tone we're going to get on camera is quite a bit darker than what I get in person. This is very light, and against a very bright white paper like this, it becomes a little harder to read. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. There is light moments of shading, like statement, where the top of the first T is a little bit darker, keeps it darker down into the beginning of the A, lightening up into the TE. The beginning of the M gets a little bit darker, but stays light through the rest. In general, while this, again, could be good for adding a little bit of a note, I don't see this as something I'm really running to. A whole page of this, too much. I did not take my notes for this whole video with this ink because of it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Manyo Yamabuki. Here is Sailor Kobe number 18. Here is Sailor Kobe number 59, Guion Romance. Here is Sailor Virginia.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is even lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does have the occasional moment of shading, like you can see with Hypothesis on the third line, where just the last S gets a little bit darker, but proof that most of this is really one tone can be seen just in what's happening with proof on the second line. Not a great one. I think you might lose the story here if this is all of your notes. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is just as light as it was on the Clairfontaine. I think it brings out the green just a little bit more, but it's really light. I was having the expectation that this paper might help darken the ink just a little bit, but I think the ink is more opaque than I would have really expected from this. No feather, no spread, light shading, horrible combination. The tone of this is making this a little bit harder to read. It kind of melts into the background. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see that we have the same tone as the Clairfontaine that does not feather, does not spread, does not shade anywhere near as nice as it did on the Clairfontaine, and does not stand out against the quad rule at all. It looks completely buried underneath it, as if a building of quad rule fell all on top of it. I can barely, I mean, this is hard. If you're doing this and you're reading it with no problem, good for you. That is not me. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Not a surprise from this ink.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks.
Here is Three Oysters Black Moss. Here is Monteverde Key Lime Pie.
Here is Rohrenklinger Vidura. Here is Zenzoy Apple Green. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is even lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, flatter, harder to see. No feather, no spread, minor moments of shading that I'm not even going to care about. Really is hiding behind the quad rule. If you're a student using this ink on this paper, you need to stop it right now, because I am not grading this. I'm not letting my eyes hurt just because you want to use something that can barely be seen. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Caran d'Ache Electric Orange. Here is Geherban Amethyst du Royal 1798.
Here is Platinum Carbon Black.
Here is Pelican 4001 Red. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we can see that the tone is really close to what we got from the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it still has moments of shading that we can see, which are in and of themselves a good thing, though seeing the ink is its own difficulty. While it performs well, if you like this could be a good combination. I just think reading this as a majority could be a difficult thing. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. So for that, it gets to be a win.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium nib of the Platinum 3776 is a dry one and really does show the weakness of this ink, as even though it does shade, it's just, wow, light. Now, off camera, I tried this in a very wet fine, and it did darken it a bunch, but not enough to see a whole page writing with this. It would still just be a little too straining on the eyes. The darker tone was easier to read, and so for that, I'm going to recommend a wet fine pen for the darker, more usable tone.